Jesus is the only God. 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 He's a king of all kings. Every nation and creed will have lifted their voices to say, Jesus is the only God. Oh, yeah. Help me say, Jesus is the only God. Yeah, Jesus
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our study for tonight. We're going to continue our study on created for purpose. And our study tonight is going to focus on Joseph. And Joseph is son of Jacob. And tonight, the way I'm going to do this lesson, I broke it up into 5 different areas to study Joseph. The first area the first area is going to deal with the main points. The second area is dealing with the shape and mold our hearts. The third area is Joseph's birth. The fourth area is Joseph's ups and downs. And then the fifth area that we'll look at while we're studying Joseph is the conclusion of his life. So let's take a look at the first area, the main points. So when you study the story of Joseph, it's told in the book of Genesis. It covers 13 chapters, or a quarter of the book of Genesis. Joseph's story is found in chapters 37 to chapter 50. And behind Joseph's story is a story of the faith, integrity, trust, and submission that he constantly showed in God by his determination to do what was right in the sight of God. And despite all his adversities, his adversaries, his challenges, and his trials, he always had the determination to do what was right in God's eyesight. And you see that Joseph at times found this kind of difficult at times to do what was right in the eyesight of God, especially when he was experiencing his ups and downs. But what you'll notice with Joseph, throughout everything that he did, throughout all his ups and downs, he remained steadfast to God. He always clung to the promises in the commandments of God. He never wavered on that whatsoever. Now let's look at the second area, shape and mold our heart. So what God does, God allows and he uses adversities, our adversaries, our trials and tribulation. He allows those in our lives. He uses them in our lives for the why. He does it to shape and mold our hearts and characters. So as these adversities, these trials and tribulation and challenge shape and mold our hearts, it does so to align and fit to God's purpose. And the concept of purpose is actually recorded for us in the Bible. It's over in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, a very familiar scripture to everyone. But before I get to there, I want to take a look at Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, and see what Joseph said about the challenges, his adversities that he faced. So Genesis 50, verse 20 reads, "But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." So when we look at that verse and begin to break it down and think about it, we see that Joseph understood all the adversities, all the challenges, all the trials and tribulation that he faced in life were not about him. Even though they were painful at times, even though they seemed difficult at times, Joseph realized that they were not about him. And just like Joseph, we got to realize the same thing. The adversities that we face are not about us, but they are a means that God uses to prepare us to accomplish his plans and his purpose. And when we look at Joseph, what Joseph understood, that everything that he went through was actually preparing him to do what he said here in chapter 50, verse 20, and that was to save much people alive. Now let's take a look at Romans 8:28. And Romans 8:28 reads, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose." As I said, this is a very familiar passage of scripture. I'm sure that you heard it many, many, many times. But what I want to do tonight is try to break that down and show you 3 concepts that demonstrate. The first key concept I want to take a look at it says for good. So that for good is the reason that everything works together. God works everything together for good and not for evil. And that brings to mind what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. He talks about how he knows the thoughts that God has toward us, to give us a peace and not of evil, to give us an expected end, to give us an expected end. The second concept that I want you to be familiar with in Romans 8:28 is where it says, them that love God. This is the why. The why that everything works together is because of your love for our God, your love for God the Father. And then the last concept I want you to take a look at, or I want to talk about, it deals with the reason, the outcome. And this outcome is to accomplish God's purpose that he called you for, to accomplish God's purpose that he called you for. So again, in Romans 8:28, there are three concepts in Romans 8:28. The reason is for the good, the why is because we love God, and then the last one, the outcome, is to accomplish God's will. So as you ponder and meditate on Romans 8:28, realize how God always works his will and all things together for the good. And when we look at Joseph, even though Joseph was scorned in his life and was abandoned to slavery by his brothers, God used Joseph mightily to redeem the nation of Israel, to accomplish his purpose. So now let's take a look at the birth of Joseph, our third area here. So when we look at Joseph's birth, we see that Rachel was barren. She could not bear any children to Jacob. So at one point when we start looking at this, we see how Rachel became very angry and perturbed, and she came to Jacob well, let me back up. She envied her sister because her sister bore several sons. So she had an envy for her sister, and she became angry with Jacob. And she came to Jacob one time, and she pleaded with Jacob, and she told Jacob to give her children, or else she would die. So in the meantime, while she still couldn't bear a child, but Rachel came up with this idea. She said, I would give my maid, Bella, to Jacob, so that her maid could bear a child in her stead for Jacob. So as we continue to looking at the birth of Jacob, we see now what happened is that God had always heard her cries. And we put that out first. God had always heard Rachel's cries. And then we see that God finally answered Rachel's pleading. And for the first time, she became pregnant. She became pregnant with Joseph. Joseph was the first son of Jacob and Rachel. He was the 11th son of Jacob's 12 sons. And when we further read in Genesis chapter 30, verses 22 to 24, we see how Joseph's name means may God add or increase. So his name means may God add or increase. So let's take a look at the fourth area here. The fourth area deals with Joseph's ups and downs, the many ups and downs that he had throughout his life. And throughout his life, he experienced many ups and downs, from being sold into slavery, to becoming a prisoner, to becoming the governor of all of Egypt. However, through all his ups and downs, as I pointed out in the beginning, he always remained steadfast. He always remained steadfast to God. He always maintained his faith, integrity, trust, and submission, regardless of what he went through. He never lost sight of those things. And just like Joseph, our lives also have their ups and downs. But through our ups and downs, especially when we're experiencing our downs, you should never forget God. You should always hold God before you, turn to him at all times. And whether you're up or down, as I said, when you're hitting rock bottom, never lose sight of our God. And sometimes we have adversities that we face, even when we do good and we try to do God's will and purpose. But God is always guiding us. He's always in control, even when things seem their darkest, even when things seem their bleakest. And during that time of adversities, we should react to adversities with wisdom, with faith, with hope, and love, just as Joseph did. So as we study Joseph, you see throughout his life, with all his ups and downs, he maintained faith, integrity, trust, and submission, and he faced all his adversities with wisdom, faith, hope, and love. And God, he never forsake Joseph, just like he would never forsake us. And at all times, you see how Joseph trusted in God. He trusted in God's word. He trusted in God's promises. All the good promises about God, Joseph trusted in there. So that's a lesson that we need to learn. Like Joseph, regardless of the adversities that we face, we need to come to the point that we'll always put God first and learn to always trust in his word, in the word of God, and his promises. Now, let's take a look at Joseph and his many colors that's recorded for us over in chapter 37. With the coat of many colors, Jacob, his father, Jacob loved Joseph more so than all of his other sons. He made and gave Joseph a coat of many colors. Now, when you study this coat of many colors, what you'll quickly find out that this was a coat that was worn by royalty. And when you also study this coat, you find out that the coat actually represents God's plan, God's purpose for Joseph's life. It also symbolized what God was going to do through Joseph's life in the future. Now, when you really look at this, all the different colors that was in this coat, but all those colors indicated they were symbolic of the incredible gifts that God had given to Joseph. So that coat of many colors represented God's plan and purpose of Joseph's life. All the colors represented the incredible gifts that God had bestowed upon Joseph. And then continuing in chapter 37, we see that Joseph was a dreamer. And Joseph actually had two dreams. He shared these two dreams with his family. In the dream, when you really focus on the dream was actually God's plan and purpose for Joseph's life. And inside the dream actually contained a prophecy. And this prophecy was that Joseph's family would become dependent upon him and humble themselves and bow themselves down before Joseph in Egypt. So when Joseph shared these two dreams with his family, it caused Joseph's brothers to become angry, and they envied Joseph even the more so. Now let's look at a life application about this. God's plan and purpose for your life, for our life, is not going to make everybody happy. Let me say that again. God's plan and purpose that he's called you for, when you start doing God's plan and purpose, it's not going to make everybody happy. As a matter of fact, when you look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 9, you'll quickly see that when we walk in God's purpose, adversaries will come with the intent of trying to discourage you from God's ordained plan and purpose. And I'm going to take a moment to read 1 Corinthians 16:9. And that reads, "For a great door and effectual is open upon me." Now watch this. "And there are many adversaries." There are many adversaries. So again, even when you're walking in God's plan and purpose for your life, you can expect to have adversities. You're going to expect to have adversaries to come against you. Those adversaries are going to come to try to discourage you from doing God's plan and purpose. And just like Joseph, God has a plan and purpose for each one of us to give us an expected end, what I talked about earlier from Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the purpose God has for your life before we go further in talking about Joseph. Now, the purpose that God has for your life, watch this now. The purpose that God has for your life is far greater than your own personal fulfillment. The purpose that God has for your life is far greater than your own personal fulfillment. Why? Because you were born by God's purpose and for his purpose. You were born for God's purpose. And now, when you look at this, you see how people, even some of us may have done this. We search for purpose of our life. We search for significance of our life. We even ask other people about what's my purpose in life, okay? So we try to search for the purpose of our life, and we always start at the wrong starting point. That wrong starting point is when we look at ourselves for that answer for purpose in our lives. And you will never find purpose for your life. You will never find purpose for your life. You will never find significance for your life when you're focused on yourself. You'll never find it by focusing on yourself. You must start with God. You must start with God, because God is not only is he the starting point for your life, he is the source of your life. And to discover your purpose for life, you must turn to God. Let me say that again. To discover your purpose for life, you must turn to God. And we discover our meaning and purpose only when we make God the reference point, only when we make God the starting point for our life. And so God actually made you for a reason. He's made every person, he's designed every person with a purpose in mind, because God made everything for his own purpose. And that's recorded for us over in Proverbs 16:4. Again, God made everything for his own purpose. And now, long before I was born, long before you were born, long before we were conceived by our parents, long before our parents knew each other, long before our parents came together, God had already conceived you in his mind and in his heart. He had already thought about the purpose that he wanted you to come forth in the earth with. So what you're going to find is that once you were born, you were already born with purpose on the inside of you. God had already instilled purpose on the inside of you. So you're going to find that once you start turning your attention to God and pray to God and ask God, what is my purpose here on earth? What have you brought me here on earth to do? What is my purpose? What is the purpose that you have called me for? So you're going to find that your life become a journey to discover God's purpose and plan for your life. So it's a journey to discover God's purpose and plan for your life. So you're going to find that God's purpose for our lives, he took into account every mistake that you will make. He took into account your human error. He took into account every sin. He took into account every ups and downs that we are experiencing. So that goes back again to Romans 8:28. So God knew all of this even before we were born, even before, as the word says, before the foundation of the world. God had already conceived you in his mind and said, this is what I want to birth this person into the earth to do. This is the purpose that I placed and called this person for. So it's only in God, through God, with God, focusing on God, talking to God, praying to God, that we will discover our origin, that we'll discover our identity, we'll discover our meaning, we'll discover our purpose, we'll discover our significance, and we'll discover our destiny. Again, it's only turning to God that we'll find that, because God is the source of our purpose. God created us. He created us for his purpose. So life is about letting God use you for God's purpose, letting God use you for his plan, and not using God for your own purpose. And the purpose of your life, like what Joseph found out, the purpose that God has placed in your life and that he's calling you for is much greater than you. It's much greater, larger than you, and it has a cosmic purpose that God designed for all eternity. So I put that out there again. The purpose, back in Romans 8:28, the latter part, it says, for his purpose. Not my purpose, not your purpose, but we were created for God's purpose, for his purpose. Now, as we begin to study Joseph, what we're going to find out too is that along with God's plan and purpose that he has for your life, Luke 2:52 comes into play. In Luke chapter 2, verse 52 reads, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So we'll see what happens now is that you can expect in your life, when you are in purpose, when you're following God's plan that he has for your life, just like he delivered Joseph from all of his affliction, and he gave Joseph the wisdom, stature, and watch this, favor before God and man. The same thing will happen in our lives. So we see, getting back to Joseph now, we see with Joseph, and this was evident in Joseph's life as we get back to Joseph, that God saved Joseph from all his affliction and gave him favor and wisdom before Potiphar, the keeper of the prison, and Pharaoh. So now let's take a moment and see how Luke chapter 2, verse 52 come into play in Joseph's life. So first, let's take a look at Potiphar. So when we look at Potiphar, this is when Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. So Joseph was only 17 years old when his brother sold him into slavery. And Joseph became the slave of Potiphar. Now watch this. This will show you how God was in control of this. God had his hands on this. So Joseph didn't just become a slave to just anybody. He became slave to Potiphar. Potiphar was a very high-ranking official for Pharaoh, a very ranking high official for Pharaoh. And he was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. So Potiphar was very, very highly placed in under Pharaoh's government. And now what we're going to see here as we begin to look at Potiphar and Joseph is that Joseph did very well with God's help. Joseph was fully, watch this now, he was a slave. He was a slave to Potiphar, but he was fully trusted by his master Potiphar. And as we look in Genesis chapter 39, it tells us all that Potiphar had, all that he had, he put into Joseph's hand. And then as we further read in chapter 39, we see that God even blessed Potiphar because of Joseph. You believe that God even blessed Potiphar because of Joseph. and now, excuse me, and now we further read here, and I'm going to, let's take a moment to look at two parts of Genesis chapter 39, verses 2 and 5 to illustrate that. Verse 3 and 5. So Genesis chapter 39, verse 3 reads, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, in that the Lord made all that he had, that he did to prosper in his hand. Now let's look at the latter part of verse 5 of Genesis 39. And that reads that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Joseph was a slave to Potiphar, but nevertheless, because Joseph was walking in God's plan, because Joseph was doing God's purpose, because Joseph maintained his faith, integrity, trust, and submission to God, that God even blessed Potiphar's house. And the verse reads, and that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So God blessed everything that Potiphar had. Imagine that Potiphar was the slave master, but because of Joseph, God blessed Potiphar. Now, as we continue reading in chapter 30, Genesis chapter 39, we see that Potiphar's wife took a fancy to Joseph, and she wanted Joseph to lie with her. But Joseph maintained his integrity, and he refused to sin with Potiphar's wife. Because Joseph refused to sin with Potiphar's wife, she became angry with Joseph. And in her angry and bitterness toward Joseph, she went to Potiphar and told lies about Joseph. She told Potiphar how Joseph tried to sleep with her. And at this point, Potiphar became angry and upset, and Potiphar put Joseph into prison. Now watch this now. Even though he put even though Potiphar put Joseph into prison, God's hand was still on what was going on. How do you know this? Because when you look at Genesis chapter 40, verse 3, it tells us that the prison was under Potiphar's authority. The prison was under Potiphar's authority. And because it was under his authority, it was still considered part of Potiphar's household. We already saw earlier back in Genesis chapter 39 that because of Joseph, that God blessed Potiphar in his household. So now let's take a look at that prison, the keeper of the prison when Joseph was in prison. And we see that God's hand was even in the prison, just like he was with Potiphar. God's hand was even in the prison. And God showed mercy and gave Joseph favor, just like he did with Potiphar. He gave Joseph of prison. And like with Potiphar, Joseph did very well with God's help. And like with Potiphar, the keeper of the prison fully trusted Joseph. The keeper of the prison trusted Joseph so much that he committed Joseph's hand to all the prisoners. And he gave Joseph, watch this now, he gave Joseph absolute authority over the entire prison. So here it is, Joseph was a prisoner himself, but because of the keeper of the prison trusted Joseph so much that he gave Joseph, committed unto Joseph, the authority over the entire prison and over all the prisoners and everything that was done in the prison. And we see, just like with Potiphar, where God caused Potiphar to prosper, Potiphar's house and his fields to prosper, the same thing happened with the keeper of the prison. And God made what Joseph did in the prison to also prosper. And let's take a moment to look at this is Genesis 39 here. I'm going to look at verse 23 of Genesis 39. And that reads, the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So like with Potiphar, the keeper of the prison also could see that God was with Joseph. Why? Because Joseph he maintained his integrity, he maintained his faith, he maintained his trust, and he was submitted to God. He was submitted to God's plan and God's purpose. Now, Joseph was a slave and a prisoner for 13 years. For 13 years, Joseph was a slave and a prisoner. Now, let's look at his pardon and release from prison. Because we already saw earlier that Joseph was a dreamer. And Joseph, through God, Joseph had the ability to interpret dreams. And because of his ability to interpret dreams, it caused him to be pardoned or released from the prison. And because of his ability to interpret dreams, he gained favor. Watch this now. He gained favor with Pharaoh. And this is over in Genesis chapter 1. Remember again about Luke 2, Luke 2, verse 52, about increase in wisdom and stature and favor before God and man. Now let's take a look at Pharaoh. So just like with Potiphar, just like with the keeper of the prison, Pharaoh, was also evident that Pharaoh and his servant also saw that Joseph had divine wisdom by the Spirit of God. Can you believe this? Here was Pharaoh with an idolatry worshiper. But when he looked at Joseph, he can see that Joseph had the divine wisdom by the Spirit of God. And just like with Potiphar and the keeper of prison, Pharaoh gave Joseph absolute authority and charge over his house. So imagine that. Here you are, a slave, and you have absolute authority over the house and everything that goes on in the house. You are a prisoner, and you have absolute authority over the prison, over the prisoners, and everything that the prisoners do. Now you come meet the Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, and he gives you authority and charge over his house. And then we see in Genesis 41, verse 40, it says, let me read that. It says, "Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled." Now, Pharaoh said this, "Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." So he was telling Joseph that I have so much trust in you because I see the divine wisdom of God on you. I'm going to give you authority over Egypt. No one else has more authority than you. It's only I that will help be greater than you. So at this point, we see where Pharaoh now made Joseph governor over all of Egypt. And he made him governor, which meant that Joseph was only second to the Pharaoh. So now we see first Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. He was a slave and a prisoner for 13 years. So at the mere age of 30, Joseph became governor over all of Egypt. And he ruled as the governor over Egypt for another 66 years after the famine ended. So let's take a moment to look at the famine. The famine that Egypt experienced bound all of Egypt to Pharaoh, and that's recorded for us over in Genesis chapter 47. And Joseph and the famine lasted 7 years. So when the famine was over, Joseph was 37 years old when the famine began. He was 44 when the famine ended. And as I said, the famine lasted for 7 years. And now watch this. This is how God used Joseph during the famine. And you'll see how God's purpose and plan really came to fruition during the famine. Now, Joseph's policies and wisdom, remember again, Luke 2:52 says that will grow, increase in wisdom, stature, and favor before God and man. So now when we see what happened now during those 7 years of famine, Joseph's policy and wisdom actually saved Egypt. Joseph's policies and wisdom actually saved Egypt. And why? Going back to Luke 2:52 again. God gave Joseph supernatural solution. God gave Joseph supernatural solution. And as a vessel for God's wisdom and direction, God used Joseph to keep the people of Egypt and everyone else from starving. And his plan caused Potiphar to prosper also. So we see again how God's hand was evident throughout Joseph's life. As a slave, it caused Potiphar to prosper. As a prisoner, it caused the prison to prosper. As a governor of Egypt, it caused the Pharaoh to prosper. Now let's look at the conclusion of Joseph's life. So this is over in Genesis chapter 49. And we see here that Jacob, when Jacob, before he died, he called all of his 12 sons before him because he wanted to bless his sons. And he began to bless each one of his sons, but he gave the greatest blessing and the longest blessing to Joseph. And that blessing is recorded over in Genesis chapter 49, verses 22 to 26. And during that blessing that he gave to Joseph, one thing that he noticed in that blessing to Joseph, he noted that despite all the adversities, despite the adversaries that came against him, despite all the challenges, how Joseph remained true to God. He remained true to God, he remained steadfast, and he did God's plan and purpose. So now we look at Joseph's bondage and death. So Joseph's bondage in Egypt was a kind of a figure of the bondage that his family was going to suffer some three generations later. And when we get to chapter 50 of Genesis, we see that Joseph died at 110 years of age. But for this whole time, he still remembered God's promises. He still focused on God's promise. And upon his deathbed, Joseph prophesied about the nation of Israel, enslavement, and freedom. So God, even when Joseph was about to die, God still used him to give a prophecy to the nation of Israel. So, and it reads as follows. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land and unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So we see here now how God mightily used Joseph to save the people. Why? Because of Joseph's integrity, because of his faith, because of his trust, because of his submission to God's plan and purpose. So I would like to conclude our study here by taking a look at a poem. And this poem was written by Russell Kiefer, and it's kind of based on Romans 12, chapter 3. And what Russell Kiefer points out, he says that the only accurate way to understand ourselves is by what God is and by what he does for us. So I'm going to read this poem by Russell Kiefer because this sums up our purpose and plan. This sums up God's purpose and plan for our lives. You are who you are for a reason. You're part of an intricate plan. You're a precious and perfect, unique design called God's special woman or man. You look like you look for a reason. Our God made no mistake. He knit you together within the womb. You're just what he wanted to make. The parents you had were the ones he chose. And no matter how you may feel, they were custom designed with God's plan in mind. And they bear the master seal. I need to read that again. The parents that you had were the ones he chose, that God chose. And no matter how you may feel, they were custom designed with God's plan in mind. And they bear the master seal. No, that trauma you faced was not easy. And God, well, that it hurt you so. But it was allowed to shape your heart so that into his likeness you will grow. You are who you are for a reason. You've been formed by the master's rod. You are who you are, beloved, because there is a God. Now, this is a poem by Russell Kiefer that summarizes the plan and purpose that God has for your life. So I thank you for coming along tonight, and hopefully you enjoyed the study about Joseph, the son of Jacob. And from our study with Joseph, the son of Jacob, you can clearly see, just like with Joseph, God made you. You point to yourself. He made you. He designed you with a plan and purpose in mind. To discover your plan and purpose that God has for you. You can only do so by turning to God.